You have to know that I'm impressed with this text on this Resurrection Sunday because of its resurrection, its restoration sort of implications. You can't read this passage, you can't read this narrative and not at least walk away thinking that there is hope for anybody who recognizes something of the restoring and redemptive and resurrection power of our God. And so this text, I think, shapes an expression of the resurrection. Without using the words, we get to see something here in this text that has reminded us of God's power to restore, to resurrect, to redeem. Now, I realize that this is a strange passage for a lot of reasons. In Daniel chapter 4, this text is strange because it's written from the perspective of a pagan king. This text is strange because you have to now immerse yourself into its place and see this through the lens of Nebuchadnezzar the king. This is not some apostle writing. This is not some prophet writing. This is literally a testimony of a king about how God worked in his life. And so it's strange because you have somebody here who is not a part of the prophetic class, not a part of the apostolic leadership. This is a king of Babylon trying to help us to understand what happened when he lost his mind and how he was able to recover his sanity. It's also interesting because there's something about this removal of his kingdom and then the resurrection of his kingdom that's not just the removal of a kingdom and the resurrection of a kingdom. It is the removal and resurrection of his sanity as well as his humanity. And so there's something about this text that I want us to be able to at least appreciate, because one of the things that he does in the beginning of chapter 4 is he just starts testifying. You have a king with a commitment to tell of God's power and to tell of God's greatness, and you can hear him bragging on God before he begins to tell his story. In fact, you heard this in verse 4 when he said, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. But one night I had a dream, and the dream shook me up, and I couldn't understand exactly what was going on. And so I called for a man named Daniel. And when you begin to read this text, you get a sense of the contrast of what happens when a person is sometimes so enamored with themselves and what it is they have done that they lose sight of how it is they got there and who placed them there. And I want to be very clear about this. This is not just Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. It's the challenge of us. Because people have a tendency of making power God. And power can never be God. God has to be God. And anything you make in place of God is always going to be something close to idolatry. And whenever you embrace power for the sake of power, you have lost sight of the reality and our need to be dependent on a God who is all powerful. In fact, Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the theologians who I read, he says that fear is basic to power. Niebuhr believes that somehow fear is usually a companion of power. In other words, if you have power, that power is always married to a kind of fear, because there is always the threat that if you have power, you can lose your power. And so the powerful are often people who live in insecure ivory towers because their power is associated with a kind of fear. Fear is basic to power, and power is always married to fear. And sometimes this dynamic needs to be analyzed, because I think it comes out of a misunderstanding of how God has made us. You see, what we don't want as human beings is we don't want to be dependent on anybody or anything. It's a part of your natural DNA. And the idea of having to recognize that I am not the master of my own fate, that I am not in control of my destiny, that somehow the future of my life does not rest sovereignly in my hands, it's a hard thing for us to embrace. But ladies and gentlemen, according to the scriptures, there are limits to the amount of power you can have. In fact, I listen to sisters who say, you know what, I don't want to be dependent on no man. And I understand that, because if you've been hurt by some messed up Negroes, you don't want to be dependent on a man anymore. I ain't throwing shade. I'm just saying, if you've been hurt, you don't want to be dependent. But my sisters, I've got to tell you, the freedom of dependence is not left to us, because there are limits on our power, and we got to be dependent on somebody. I've heard old folks say, well, when I get older and I can't fend for myself, I don't want to be dependent on anybody. But I got news for you. Because of the way we are wired, whether you're a sister or a senior adult, at some point in your life, you will find yourself dependent on somebody. Because nobody gets to live this life without being dependent on someone. And may I tell you that the original sin in the Garden of Eden was around this issue. Because God said there's one tree in the midst of the garden from which you cannot eat. And the minute they heard that there were limits on what they could do, their resentment for being dependent on God is a part of the same sin that's in all of us. You see, this idea of resenting anybody who can put limits on you is a part of your natural humanity. And it started with your forebears, Adam and Eve, and it remains now. You see, what they decided was, we don't want to be dependent on God, we want to be God. And whenever you have misappropriated the place of power for the sake of power, missing your dependency on God, you will always be creating an idol that will get in the way when coupled with your pride. And you've got to just adjust to the fact that there are limits to what you can and what you cannot do. This is why when you are blessed and you excel, you ought to thank God. When you find yourself flourishing, you ought to thank God. You ought to recognize that you achieve nothing by your own hand, and you don't ascend by virtue of your own strength. You have to accept that you are finite and that your dependence on God, and you keep telling the world, no matter how the accolades come or how the success comes, you tell somebody it was nobody but the Lord. You don't stick out your chest and pretend somehow that you are in control of your life or your destiny. Why? Because there are limits to the power that God permits us to possess. And all of us are moving through a kind of resistance where we don't want to be dependent. But God says, you know what? You could change if you recognize that there were limits on what you could do, and that there were no limits on what I can do. And in fact, you have been trying to change yourself for a lot of years, but you've not been able to succeed, because there are limits on what it is you can do on behalf of yourself. And notice what happens in this text. When you read this narrative, notice that the king, coming out of verses 1 through 5, he moves from this place of peace and tranquility to terror. And now you've got power terrified. That's why I think Niebuhr is right on this issue of the ways in which fear is always connected to power. This is the most powerful man on the planet. This is the king of Babylon. And yet he can't sleep at night. So he tweets. The most powerful. And yet, he's a man who, because of a bad dream, is not able to sleep. And he's missed the fact that power born of fear will always give birth to more fear. Herodotus, when he writes, Herodotus, the historian, Herodotus said that 100 years later, after Babylon and the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. 100 years later, the city of Babylon's grandeur was still stunning. Its grandeur was astonishing to the eyes. 200 years later, Alexander the Great wanted to make Babylon his headquarters. And when you consider what this must have looked like, it's almost easy to see why someone would swell with pride and assume that somehow they built this. But what Nebuchadnezzar had missed was that he had not built anything. And he lost sight of the fact that pride always has a price. That somehow when you are too proud to recognize that you need help, when you are too proud to recognize that you do nothing in and of your own strength, when you are too proud to appreciate that it's God who's the giver of everything, pride will always have a price. Bernie Madoff. Some of you all remember Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison because of a $65 million Ponzi scheme. And when Bernie Madoff was asked, what was the root of your crime? What was the root of your problem? Bernie Madoff blamed it on pride. I heard Mr. Madoff declare that at some point in the past, he had a year in which he should have reported extreme losses. But because he was a money manager and afraid of the injury it would provide for his reputation, he decided he wouldn't say anything. And because of his desire to maintain his own power and maintain his reputation, he couldn't admit that he had made some errors in judgment. And so he began to hide his weakness. And don't you know, one of the first steps down that path is when your pride will not allow you to acknowledge that you have had some errors in judgment, that you have had some missteps, that you have made some mistakes. And this is why pride is such a diabolical thing, because what pride does is it insulates you from the truth. And it doesn't allow you to hear truth from others nor yourself. And this is why many of the ways in which power sort of seeps in and creeps in and destroys individuals is because they move themselves out of the realm of being teachable. And nobody can tell them that you are not the best thing since sliced bread. And what happens is this slow descent, this slow slide that begins not with great big things, but with very little things. Because a little bit of cheating here and a little dishonesty there and a little bit of trickery there ultimately leads to this crash in which you wake up one day looking like Wolfman. This is a strange story because in this text, this is a man whose pride and commitment to power leads him to a place of such depth. Let me say something to you about this. When you look at this narrative and look at this story, I told you that pride has a price. But I want you to see something here, and I want you to just back up for 2 seconds. He says here inside this passage, inside chapter 4, in 27, King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. Do you see that? Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. Can I just tell you that inside this idea, repentance is not just stopping something. Repentance is connected to starting something else. See, you can't claim that you're just going to stop living a certain way and think that that's the end of the process. It's not enough to just stop something if you don't also start something else. And some of that is located in a love and a passion and an affection you must have for something other than that thing or yourself. Let me give you some pit bull theology. I watched my son's dogs, and one of them has a deep affection for a rope. And when he has the rope in his mouth, you can pull on that rope and you can see him just get into his natural head shaking vibe. He's a good dog. He's a docile dog, well socialized. But when he's got his rope is a toy that he loves. But he loves that rope until I show him the ball. And when I show him the ball, he drops the rope. Some of you have been trying to stop doing certain things all your life, trying to quit something and let something go. But you see, you can't let something go until you find something else you love more. And all of your straining to stop doing something and let something go will never be achieved until you love something more than the thing you presently have. Am I making sense to you? And when you finally love him more than you love anything or anybody else, I promise you some stuff you can let go. Do I have a witness? You don't have to keep straining at the bit and trying to be good. When you learn to love him more than yourself, certain things drop. I'm trying to help you because you've been trying to stop doing this, that, and the other for decades. And you'll never be able to stop it until you love something else. And when you finally fall in love with him, it changes everything else you thought you valued and prioritized. Because it'll never be enough to just let something go if you don't start doing something else. That's why Daniel said, King, it's not enough for you to just stop doing this. You've got to start being merciful to the poor. You've got to start providing something. You can't just stop hating. You got to start loving. You can't just stop stealing. You got to start giving. You can't just stop cussing. You got to start speaking the truth and blessing people. You can't just stop a thing. You've got to fill it with something else. King Nebuchadnezzar has missed this idea. But what I like about the text is that there's the ability to be restored and there's the ability to be resurrected through repentance. You say, Williams, what do you mean? Well, when you can acknowledge that heaven really rules, there are some things that change. Look at the text if you would, and I'll make my way to conclude. If you would, if you don't mind, just look in verse 22 of chapter 4. And do you see that verse that says, that tree, your majesty, is you? Do you know that everybody needs somebody in their life who can tell them the truth, no matter what the consequence might be? You know, Nebuchadnezzar was a hot-headed, hot-tempered, capricious king. He lost his cool. You see that throughout the entire book of Daniel. But every now and then, what God has to place in your life is somebody who can tell you who you are and not step back and shrink. There are some people who you need in your life because they won't back down. They'll tell you who you are, and they'll let you know where you're at. And you need to embrace those people because they're the people who keep you from falling. What I like about Daniel is that even though he's talking to a king, he's not afraid to say, no, this is you. I'm reluctant to gloat in it, but I'm not afraid to tell you what I know is true. And do you know what the world needs? Christian people who will simply say what's true. Stop covering up for each other. Stop acting like it's a conspiracy against. When you know a thing is wrong, say it's wrong. Don't act like you got to hug all the time. Some of the ways you love somebody is by telling them when they're wrong. If I'm headed for a cliff and you don't try to help me, don't then tell me that you love me. How you going to let me go down, knowing I'm going to go down, claiming you love me? You need to tell the truth. You say the problem in the church is this, that, and the other. No, it's truth. Because we see each other, but we don't tell each other what we know to be true. This man, in my mind, is worthy of honor because he's not afraid to tell the truth. And as he tells the truth, it's not a good truth. Why? Because the king will not repent. And the king descends into this place of sheer insanity. In other words, he has lost his mind. And you know what? When you don't allow the sovereign rule of God in heaven to rule, you live and act like you've lost your mind. You may not say the words, but you look just as crazy. Because the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The subtext of that is that she lives as if there was none. And this idea of living in that way is really insanity. This man has lost his mind. And notice, he's out now living like an animal. Because pride will make you a predator. Pride dehumanizes you. Pride and arrogance in power doesn't increase your humanity, it depreciates your humanity. And pride mixed with power makes you more animalistic than human. He doesn't just look like an animal. He's now behaving with animal characteristics. Out of his kingdom, loss of reputation, loss of power. And what I want you to understand to some degree this morning is that this is a worst case scenario. But the good news is that anybody can change. In fact, here's the way the text works it out. He says here inside verse 34, after this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. Could I simply tell you this, no matter who you are, God will honor those who honor him. If you will make a commitment to honor the Lord in terms of your enterprise, in terms of your industry, your job, your career, whatever you're engaged in, if you will make a commitment to honor God, I'm telling you, God will honor those who honor him. No matter where you find yourself, no matter what your career choice might be, if you will make a commitment to honor God wherever you are, God has ways of blessing and honoring people who honor him. You don't have to like everything that takes place on a job or in a particular environment. But if while you're there, you make your commitment to honor the Lord, I promise you, whether it's in the home, whether it's in the corporate center, if you will simply not be ashamed of the Lord and will commit to honor him with your time and with your resources and with your talent, I'm telling you, God can send you to places you haven't even thought about. Some of you right now are occupying positions and you don't have a degree. You know you have no business there, but God raised you up. Some of you have taken your little and tried to honor God faithfully with your giving. And right now don't have a bill to worry about because you honored God with your resources and he blessed you to the point where he either gave you what you wanted for free or brought the price down so you could afford it. Because if you honor God, God has a way of honoring you. Do I have a witness? There's stuff you're in right now, own right now, and you know you have no business there. But God honored you because you made an effort to honor God. This is what he does. This was discipline. This was pain inflicted with a motive of correction and resurrection and redemption. He wasn't out to punish and destroy Nebuchadnezzar. He was out to help Nebuchadnezzar understand something that he couldn't have understood any other way. And sometimes the pain in our lives that we encounter is nothing more for the believer than the discipline of God. Why? Because when humans try to become more than human, they become less than human. And you can't live for your own glory. You got to find a way to live for the glory of God. And I love the way he declares this. He says, after time passed, I looked up. And then he made this assessment. He says, you know what? His rule is everlasting, and his kingdom is eternal, and all the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, what do you mean by doing these things? And when my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom, notice, with even greater honor than before. I'm telling you that if Nebuchadnezzar could change, I'm telling you that anybody can change. And I'm saying if anybody would identify the limits of their own power and the fact that sometimes pride is unlimited, and at least begin to check yourself in recognition of how it creeps up, I'm telling you, God will bless that person. I believe in a God who is sovereign and can restore and resurrect my sanity and my humanity and keep me from living in a beastly way, because he understands that he's made me for more, but he's made me for himself. You know what I realize, that in an audience like this, I have to be careful with my examples, but I want to call a man named Tom Brady to the front. I know the Eagles fans in here and the Giants fans in here and the Dallas Cowboy fans in here. I don't want to insult you, but there's something I understand about Tom Brady. You see, I know we're all sort of twisted and bent out of shape about the deflation of some footballs. But I understand why Tom deflated some footballs. I know it's hard for some folks to accept, but I know why he did it. Because Tom understood that a deflated football is easier to control. You see, when you take some of the air out of a football, you can get a better grip on the ball, and you can throw the ball where you want it to go, and the ball loses its own will and now has to succumb to the will of the one in whose hands it's held. Now, I don't know if you're catching it by now, because I'm not talking about footballs. I'm talking about what happens to us when we are deflated, when we lose our pride and lose our ego. It's then when the hand of God can grip you, aim you, and throw you in the direction that he wants you to go. You say, at the end of the day, who dances? I dance. Why? For his glory. I celebrate. Why? For his glory. Because what he's done for me. Do I have a witness anywhere? What he's done for me can't nobody do. And I know a king who can deflate and inflate. One day he laid down his glory. One day he submitted to the Father. One day he gave up his crown and said, I'll serve in order to save for my sake. And that king's name is Jesus, who became man so that man can become like God. The king who sat down so that we can stand up. The one who died so that we can live. And the one who has restored and resurrected and redeemed us by his grace. If you love him, say yes. I know somebody who can change anybody into somebody who can stand for his glory. Come on, give him praise this morning. That's our King. That's our King who has restored us, raised us, given us a brand new life. And I'm telling you this morning, he can do it for anybody. If he's done it for us, how many of you all know that the Lord has changed you? Is there anybody here who knows that it was nobody but Jesus who's transformed and changed